Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Hey, welcome back, everybody. I am really excited to be joined yet again, and you are well familiar with Gregg Gassman, Pope.
I do call my wife my vice pope, so I guess by implication, that's vice pope, Mrs. Pope in the history, of course.
Host of the great podcast Popeular History, where he is taking a Rex Factor look at the cardinals, and he's also discussing the Pope. So, Gregg, welcome back to the show. People should be familiar with you at this point. If they're not, definitely go back and listen to our Francis episodes, because those were wonderful. And then definitely tune into your show. Obviously, the big bomb has dropped, and we have a new Pope Leo XIV. Let's just dive right into it. Tell us a little bit about Pope Leo XIV and where this guy came from.
Yeah, so he came from Chicago. I think this is not news to anyone who is listening to this, because obviously you have some interest in the popes, and this is something that everyone was talking about very intensely 1 month ago. Part of the reason we're sitting down tonight is because it is the 1 month anniversary of Pope Leo's election as the first American pope, and our first Leo in about 100 years, which is not that long in church history terms. Still, his Leo the 13th would definitely still be considered like a modern pope, but the American connection definitely raised a lot of eyebrows, and we'll definitely be talking about that as we go. But yeah, Chicago, one of the Midwestern cardinals. One of the things that really struck me, just looking at the American cardinals as a whole, like 80% of them, even if you use, the least, the lowest interpretation, 80% of the American cardinals are from the Midwest. And you can get that up to like 90, depending on how you count, because like one of the cardinals that's usually listed as American is from Ireland, which, not necessarily American born there. But, Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost wound up with Peruvian citizenship, being American born himself. So I don't know. I think you could, it's almost like double counting if you're counting him still as an American, when you've got another cardinal who was born in Ireland coming over, after ordination and also being counted as an American. Because Pope Leo did, he grew up in Chicago. He was ordained in the U.S., but then not long after that, he went off to missionary work in Peru. And that's really where he served his career. But I don't begrudge any Americans for counting him. He has, as far as I know, he still has American citizenship, picking up Peruvian citizenship on top of that. And now, I believe, just by default, Vatican citizenship as well. So I don't know if you're going to have triple citizenship or how that works.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Somebody who went by Bob before he became Pope. It's hard, and growing up in Chicago, it's hard to not count him as American.
Yeah, it's pretty American name.
Yeah. And that really gets into the interesting. We can go into his background there's nothing really shocking in there, I don't think, besides the fact that he was born in the U.S. He followed a pretty standard way that you would get into the higher echelon of the cardinal and the curia.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the most surprising thing, in his broader background is, if you squint, I've seen articles, talking about just sort of like, he has some Creole heritage. So, depending on how much you want to stretch things, and I'll leave, this interpretation up to people with more of a vested interest in, or I don't know, people just know more about these things than I do, but I've seen interpretations of him as saying like, oh, hey, first black pope, because, you know, he had this Creole heritage on his mother's side, like his grandfather on that side was, I believe, born in Haiti. So that was sort of an interesting genealogical surprise. And it's one of those things where I don't even think he necessarily knew that about his own past, because you look at the census records and it kind of switches from just this, it switches over the years once they moved to Chicago, which is a thing that happened, you know, historically, with just different families going after what makes the most sense for them.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things when you start digging back, you don't really know what's going on back there.
Right. And, you know, in the end, my conclusion of that is, you know, look, the records are what they are as far as the genealogy goes. I'll let other people interpret that. But it was a bit of a surprise.
How did he even get into the church or find his calling into the priesthood in the first place? Yeah.
So he comes from a pretty Catholic family. Like he's got several, I believe it'd be aunts, certainly great aunts, that went into religious life. So it's, you know, one of those families where that's not an unheard of, thing. I haven't seen a lot talking particularly about his initial calling. But I'm sure, you know, that information, if it's not already out there, is going to get out there more. I mean, obviously we get more of an in-depth bio once someone is elected to the papacy. But he joined the Augustinian order relatively early on, which, by the way, I don't know how much you looked into the Augustinians or how much you know the history there, Steve, but they were one of the oldest orders in the church, by any measure. And you could argue that they were there even before the Benedictines, if you really do count it, tracing back to to St. Augustine. Which is a bit of a stretch just with the history of it, but it's not the stretchiest stretch that any religious order has ever made. I'm looking at you Severites, who allegedly trace back to like Isaiah. Or is it Elijah? I forget which one.
And so he joins this order, and it's nothing like it. Nothing screams that he becomes a missionary in Peru, and that's kind of interesting.
Yeah. And really, I mean, you know, what stands out when you look at his bio is this is very much a person who is prominent today because of Pope Francis. And it's not just because, you know, Pope Francis made him a bishop, right? And then made him a cardinal, and then made him, you know, head of dicastery for bishops. And, you know, this kind of, you know, literally what's the role in promoting him, but he's very much a Francis style, bishop, the sort of, you know, cleric that Pope Francis really liked, right? I don't think that missionary connection hurt him. But I think certainly he's in that mold of, Pope Francis would say, you know, he's looking for pastors who smell like their sheep, right? Just that real, direct ministry. Like you see him, you know, going literally through floodwaters, right? Or riding a burro, in his, diocese of Chiclayo in, Peru. And I hope I got that pronunciation relatively in the ballpark, but, yeah, I mean, he had a fondness for his flock there. And, you know, he even gave them a little shout out, even though he wasn't their bishop, hadn't been for a couple of years by the time of his election, because he kind of gone on to Rome full time. But he still gave them a shout out in his first speech as Pope, which I thought was kind of touching. And notably, he would not give such a shout out to his U.S. roots, but he has, you know, I mean, it's not like he's denying that. You know, he's had a few shout outs since then. But I definitely thought it was interesting, just to see that, you know, it seems like he left his heart in Peru, such as it were. But also, I think, you know, with becoming Pope, it's one of those situations where he does, as people often do, and as theoretically you should do, people kind of see themselves as a new person, right, once they're elected to the papacy.
And I think it's, in a way, it's not really shocking that somebody so tight with Francis would become Pope. I think that I don't think anybody would have been shocked by that that it's basically a Francisite, you might say, was elected.
Yeah. I mean, in the end, 80% of the cardinals that were cardinal electors in this recent conclave were themselves appointed by Pope Francis. And, the remaining 20%, had themselves participated in a conclave that elected Pope Francis. Obviously, they're not necessarily opposed to that model themselves, although who knows, what went on even in the last conclave. But yeah, I mean, when you think about it like that, it's like, okay, it's not that big of a surprise, but you can see surprises sometimes. I mean, it's interesting when you think about it, like the conclave that elected like JP1, right? John Paul I. A lot of people don't know a ton about John Paul I, but just from his brief papacy and from his bio, right, he was a different sort of candidate. He was looking like he was going to be a different sort of pope than what we got with John Paul II, right? He was on the older and not so old that 33-day papacy was expected, but it was definitely a different sort of election with essentially the same cardinals, right? There were a couple that were different from one to the other consistory in 1978, but you can see surprises even with, that case study, like two conclaves of basically the same situation.
The politics of it, I would think that to see somebody as an outsider coming in, or as somebody who wouldn't be directly who you would expect, to me that would seem like a long drawn out conclave. Mm-hmm. And the fact that I haven't been able to dig up how many votes were actually cast. It must have been in the neighborhood of less than 4.
Yeah. I mean, it was, I think at most it was the, it seemed like it was probably the 4th ballot, I believe, was what we concluded when we were talking about it, with the Pontifex folks and I, because we had that first almost trial ballot, right? And then I believe we'd gone through one other round of balloting, like that morning, because I remember, Dad came and joined me. This was when I was in my conclave bunker, right, just kind of doing this full time. And then, the next smoke was early, so that would mean that would be the 4th ballot. Exactly. So, which is pretty early in the process, right? Like that's definitely on the sooner end, right? It's been a long time since there's been, anyone on the 1st or even 2nd ballot. And usually the 2nd or the 3rd or 4th ballots are going to be like, if you looked at the betting odds, as soon as that white smoke came up, like before they announced the name, right? So people were still, doing their betting lines or whatever. And probably even more furiously than they had. Suddenly the line or whatever the term is for, Cardinal, Paroline, right? The number one, contender, such as it were, the most logical early ballot. Suddenly he was at 80%, right?
Chance he shot through the roof.
Guessing. Yeah. But no, we absolutely got a surprise. Not a complete surprise. He was not absolute dark horse. He was on someone like the more extended list of Popeular. But I would say he was not in the top 10 with one exception. So there's a gentleman who runs, I believe it's called the Papability Index on what I believe is called X still at this point, former Twitter. Gabe runs that Papability Index over there, and he hit the nail on the head. He absolutely predicted Cardinal Prevost, and everyone was giving him a hard time because, it's an American. Like, what are the odds they're not going to elect an American, right? I mean, Cardinal Prevost himself said that to his brother, who is interesting. We'll talk a little bit more about him here in a minute. But he's like, look, I'm an American. They're not going to elect an American Pope. He said that going into the conclave. So I guess it was a surprise to him as well.
That's, to me, what seems so weird is that coming out so quickly, you figure they throw that first vote, and that's kind of a throwaway. Right. It's the first night they come in, date, then that second day they're voting. To me, doesn't it? At least to me, it feels like there was a sort of like this was in the works, that maybe he wasn't the handpicked successor, but he was maybe in a short list of handpicked successors.
And I mean, if you just look at the role that he was in, that was what really helped him. And that's what kind of, propelled him, surprisingly to the top, actually, of Gabe's list. But the fact that he was heading that dicastery for bishops, that is not a small role, right? That is the main person who chooses who the bishops are going to be, worldwide, right? So that's definitely an influential position in the church that Pope Francis had relatively recently, entrusted him with. That was, I mentioned he hadn't been the Bishop of Chiclayo in Peru for a couple of years. That was because he got called to Rome to head up that dicastery, that, department for bishops. So that made him be elevated also to the status of a cardinal bishop. In the end, he actually got that particular promotion earlier this year, like a couple weeks before Francis's first, his, I guess, last big hospitalization back in February. He went ahead and made him a cardinal bishop, right? That highest ranking within the cardinals. And so, he was one of, I'm gonna catch myself here, because what happened was that was an time when Pope Francis actually expanded the number of cardinal bishops. So, traditionally there would be 7, give or take a little bit if you squint. But Pope Francis, it's now up to like 12 or 13, I want to say, cardinal bishops. And then there's some fudging with the patriarchs who technically have the same rank. But bottom line, he was in that top tier. And a lot of the folks in that top rank of the cardinals were themselves over 80, right? So they wouldn't be in the conclave anyways. So, he's one of maybe like 3 or 4 cardinal bishops voting in the conclave. So, when you look at it that way, he's less of an outside candidate. But again, like that, the fact that American got picked, and apparently in relatively short order, is genuinely surprising. I do think, if I could, this is purely me theorizing here, right? But I do think it was, they sort of wanted, if you will, almost a like Trump whisper, just with the way things are just uncertain generally in the world order at this point. I think that they wanted someone who could have that interface with the U.S., and recognizing, like, he's going to be Pope for, hopefully many years to come, right? So it's not just, I don't think it was necessarily just a knee-jerk reaction, but I do think having that voice that can access, this powerful nation, right? And it's not even necessarily just about, the current president, but just being able to have that direct interface, such as it were, right? Or I guess, maybe hopefully like a little bit more influence, or just, I don't know, being able to be a little bit more in the room there, to sort of naturally speaking the same language and such. It is cool and weird to have a pope who speaks English natively. I'm used to them being relatively fluent because most of them have been, but I mean, obviously, yes, grew up in Chicago. English is perfect. It's not his 4th or 5th language like it often is with these popes.
Hey, Steve here. If you're enjoying the History of the Papacy podcast, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. We're working toward going completely listener funded, which means no more ads ever. When you join, you get early access to episodes, monthly book giveaways, and most importantly, your name is added to the History of the Papacy Diptychs, our own list of commemorated supporters. You can become an Antioch level supporter for just $3 per month. But it makes a huge difference to making the History of the Papacy ad-free and independent. Nobody likes ads, not you, not me, and I'm the guy who records them. So let's just get rid of them. Visit patreon.com/History of the Papacy and join today. I wonder too if one of the things I've been thinking about is that in a way, a lot of ways, the United States is like neutral ground. It's European kind of, but there's the conservative elements that for the Africans and some of the other more conservative leanings, you can kind of paint with any brush you want with America. As far as inside Catholic baseball.
Exactly. Yeah. From that Catholic perspective. It's also interesting that, it's still considered, and I think I would say rightly so, right? It's still categorized under mission territory from a Catholic perspective. So yeah. Which, I mean, there's definitely a lot of eyes on, how this American Pope is going to, connect with or dialogue with or, also challenge, the president and, any future presidents. And there's definitely been a lot of speculation, for example, this coming Saturday, there's a event that, Pope Leo is going to be, participating in remotely in Chicago. And I guess it's kind of the same day as this military parade that Trump has set up, and a lot of people are kind of commenting oh, is that it looks like maybe it's a bit of counter programming, not a direct on the nose thing, but just hey, here's something else you can do to sort of I don't know, just have some sort of presence in that overall conversation. And certainly much like Pope Francis, Pope Leo has been messaging pretty strongly in terms of migrants and refugees, which obviously is, a pretty big issue for Trump, coming from the other side of that perspective, right? Protecting borders versus, being more open with things, right? I mean, I was surprised this morning, apparently, in his homily, or maybe it was the Angelus this Sunday, so probably the Angelus, though it could have been homily. Either way, Pope Leo was specifically talking about issues with nationalism, right? And just encouraging more openness between countries. So I was that's pretty on the nose in the context, right? By papal standards, they're usually more oblique generally, although I guess Francis wasn't particularly. So maybe that's just a thing that's changed.
It really puts the Catholic Church, I think, in the U.S. in a really interesting and challenging position, because he is no longer speaking. I think in a lot of ways they may have elected him as a counterpoint to Trump or to American power, but he could wind up either galvanizing or alienating Catholics in the U.S.
Oh, yeah.
Very easily, and at both at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, there's, as you kind of mentioned, there's a relatively healthy, not to put it in, too political of terms, but, a relatively healthy opposition or, disagreement with Pope Francis generally in the U.S., right? A more traditionalist sort of approach, for example, the Latin Mass situation, right? The back and forth on that. A lot of folks are really, reading the tea leaves, trying to see, if he's going to do something to bring that back or open that back up a bit. And that's been primarily, my experience, an issue in the U.S. where there really is, this movement that, is sort of galvanized around that particular topic. I think generally the USCCB, right, the gathering of U.S. bishops, is pretty much on the same page with Pope Francis and now Pope Leo in terms of the immigration issue, which is interesting because it's actually not the case so much in Europe. There's some more disagreement on that there. But the Latin Mass and like that more traditional liturgy is more the area of disagreement in the U.S. there. So it'd be interesting to see how that shakes out, on the church side, and then, what that exchange looks like on the political side, right? The secular side in terms of the immigration stuff. We've seen Trump feuding with Musk, right? Is there going to be, feuding with Pope Leo? I would say probably. I think it'll probably be a little bit more before we have that, because there's still kind of that new Pope smell, right? You don't want to, go too rough on that situation. But who knows? The Pope Leo does have, he's got two brothers, and one of them is definitely more in the news. And the one that I said, we'd circle back to is his brother, Louis, or I guess it might be Louis. But he's living in Florida, and he's actually, bit of a Trump supporter himself, MAGA, promoter. And so, the media definitely likes to talk to him, and he certainly doesn't seem to be opposed, right? There's a video that made me chuckle, where, he's on the phone, like the day of the election, or maybe like the day after, with like CNN or like some sort of major, news agency, just interviewing the Pope's brother in his basement or whatever. And like, he just calls the Pope, and the Pope's like, oh, okay, so you're talking with him now? Okay. That's cool, I guess. Like you could, to me, it seemed like Pope Leo would have been very, very happy for his brother to hang up, but he knew he couldn't just say that. I imagine I would probably be annoyed if I had just been elected Pope and suddenly, I mean, I guess you got to get a microphone thrust in your face, but getting it via your brother is a bit interesting.
Now, maybe we can discuss a little bit of this issue, because it's an issue that keeps coming up at least in the U.S., is of this Latin Mass. And I wonder, is that an issue that is international, or is that something that's more particular to the U.S.? So in terms of the grand scheme of things, it is international. Because, it was a switch from this Tridentine form to the Novus Ordo, right? The new form of the Mass. And the shorthand of it, right, is to say Latin Mass. But it's not just a change in the language of the Mass, right? From predominantly Latin to predominantly, vernacular, right? Whatever the spoken language of the area would be. But you could have the new form of the Mass, right? The post-Vatican II Mass. You could have that in Latin. So it's not like just a language thing. There was a lot of like, I guess, tweaking, right? And I'll put it to you this way. I'm offending a lot of people with my comments right now because I'm not getting it spot on. And usually people who are particularly concerned about these issues circling around the Latin Mass are going to want to be very particular about the specifics. For me, I do think that the Tridentine liturgy is beautiful. I have been to Tridentine liturgies a few times. I do personally think it's something that should be preserved. And, with John Paul II, it kind of, was in the process of fading out, because when you have a church council like Vatican II, and the biggest, most noticeable change to come out of Vatican II was the switch in the Mass, right? From the Latin, sort of facing away from, or, the same direction as, whatever your preferred terminology is, right?
which way the priest was facing was the next most obvious change apart from the Latin. So when you have, the priest turn around and suddenly, he's speaking English or whatever the local language is, that's a pretty obvious change, with the mass. And when you have a major change come out from a church council, I think historically it's not unexpected to have, 100 years or more where people fight about that change, right? And typically it does end up settling down on, kind of going along with what the council said. But usually, they'll have some sort of disagreement issue, which is not really what happened in Vatican II. It almost came out of the blue. But what I'm getting at is it's not unusual to have this period of back and forth about implementing the council for a few generations after an ecumenical council, which is something that we're seeing. I've definitely seen some more of the Latin Mass sort of back and forth going on in Europe. Particularly, it seems in France, and I want to say somewhat in England. But really, a lot of it is that U.S. centric. I don't think it's been as much of an issue in Africa, just because a lot of the evangelization there has been, it was already more likely to be in local languages. Even before Vatican II, right? There's more like missionary exceptions and sort of things. But they didn't have that as deep of an aspect of their tradition. Now, granted, some of the African cardinals are very, much more interested in it than I think the average African, from my experience, right? Which admittedly is extremely limited. So in the end, yes, largely a U.S. issue, but not exclusively. It's certainly something that's had, noticeable impact around the world, right? And at this point, just for context, the Latin Mass is largely restricted. Like, you're not even allowed to promote it in church bulletins. I think at all. I think, like, you could still have the Latin Mass with permission of the local bishops, but they're really not supposed to grant that permission unless it's like really extenuating circumstances, right? And they've got to give, like, more approvals from the Vatican than they used to. It used to just kind of be like, well, if you feel like allowing that, you can allow that, right? You're a bishop, so you can just kind of choose. It got a lot more restricted under Pope Francis, and we'll see if that, kind of gets lifted under Pope Leo or not. I don't know. I think long term, it probably, unfortunately, is going to not be a regular thing. But we'll see.
Overall, the tribes, so to speak, seem to unite behind Leo more than I thought they would. I thought you would hear a lot more, just because this is the age we live in, and you're always going to get somebody who's going to be mad about it. But there didn't seem to be a huge outcry from any group in particular.
Yeah, no, I mean, the condemnations that I've seen, have largely been from outside the church. It's like, oh, well, this is another liberal pope. Like, okay, but like, what does that even mean? Necessarily in the Catholic context. Like, was Leo XIII a liberal pope? Like, if you just mean like, in favor of, relatively free migration. I mean, that's been the stance of the Catholic Church for a while. Like, here you had Pius XII calling deportations an intrinsic evil, right? Shortly after the Second World War. And obviously the deportations there were of unusually heinous character. But, that's not something particularly new, right? And I think that's more just of taking the church and putting it into more of just a specific political context and really what it's all about.
And so what do you think the major issues, because presumably that they didn't elect somebody who was 69 years old to be a placeholder. Mm-hmm. He could very easily have 15, maybe 20 years of papacy ahead of him. What issues do you think they were electing him for?
So I think we are going to see the stabilization and formalization of a lot of the things that Pope Francis kind of kicked off, right? Like the curial reform, Not that Pope Francis got particularly far with that. Like, he got the wrenches out and, changed a bunch of titles, but the question is always going to be, how much does this really practically change things, right? But I do think you'll see, more along those lines, just kind of like, cementing the changes that have been made. I do think, like, for example, the Council of Cardinals that Pope Francis set up, I think either that's here to stay or we're going to see more fundamental tweaking of what the College of Cardinals is and how it works. Apparently, Pope Leo, one of his, kind of initial promises was that he would have the cardinals come together, not just for when it's time to make new cardinals, right? Or to just sign off on some canonization or whatever, but to have them come together actually as a body and have, basically the sort of deliberations that they had in the lead up to conclave, right? The general congregations, they're called, like, their pre-conclave meetings, where they presumably, that's where some of the groundwork that ultimately resulted in Pope Leo got laid ahead of the actual balloting. But it sounds like he's planning on having them come to Rome at least once a year for that sort of thing, is at least what one source was saying that he had kind of promised upon election. Now, that same source indicated that Pope Francis had done the same, and that didn't really pan out. So we'll see, if that actually becomes a thing. But that's certainly one thing, is that kind of restructuring the way the church works, especially with an eye towards the whole synodality process that Pope Francis started, and which theoretically still has, I think, 5 years left. But I think Pope Francis had just laid out a roadmap for, 5 more years of synod on synodality, kind of implementation period. So I do think that will at least, formally, continue and, be finished. I'm not sure if it'll take exactly the same, mode that Pope Francis would have done, but it's hard to tell what Pope Francis was going to do with that in the end, because he was definitely a pope that liked to put out a number of different signals and, was not afraid of looking contradictory, right? He definitely liked to keep people guessing. I don't think we're going to see as much of the guessing with Pope Leo. I think, he's going to be more on the predictable end. Not that it would be that hard to be a bit more on the predictable end than Pope Francis. I think that's fair to say as far as popes go. He liked to surprise people, but I think that's where you get that stability factor, because I think the cardinals will probably, honestly, look, I like Pope Francis. At the end of the day, though, I think if I were a cardinal, I probably would have been a little bit tired of trying to guess at what was coming next. So I think they were probably hoping for a little bit more stability. I do think that they will get some of that, but I don't think it's going to be, a marked shift from Pope Francis's overall, priorities. One of those priorities, for example, being Pope Francis promoted pretty consistently, especially later on in his pontificate, women to higher positions than they had been largely in the Vatican, right? Like that dicastery for bishops that I was talking about, had just had women added as voting members to, choose bishops across the world in the last few years, in particular under Cardinal Prevost at the time, with Pope Francis kind of heading the overall church, and then Cardinal Prevost, the head of that particular division. And then he's already, Pope Leo has already appointed a few women to higher level positions, in addition to keeping, everyone who already was in their place under Pope Francis. He kind of said, okay, we're going to go ahead and re-up, everyone to their same roles, right? But then some of the replacements that have happened since due to, whatever retirements or things like that, or I think it might have been his own vacancy, he filled with another woman. So there's definitely been some of that. I keep wondering if and when we're going to see what I'm calling a cardinal, right? A woman made a cardinal, probably a nun, right? There's a few. Raffaella Petrini is a name that I keep popping up, right? She's currently heading the secular side of Vatican City State, and that's normally a post that's always been held by a cardinal. So it'll be interesting to see when his first batch of cardinals comes out. We'll see what that looks like, right? Is it going to be one of those things of Pope Francis where he likes to, put one of the more unexpected bishops on the list, or, could it even be a cardinal type situation? I'm guessing probably not, at least not on the first go, but I think probably yes is my guess for, sometime in the next 20 years. So we will see about that.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. I wonder if Pope Leo XIV, if he really carries on with Pope Francis's agenda, does he kind of subsume Pope Francis's legacy? I'm wondering if Pope Francis kind of goes into the wayside if, and let's see, it's 2025 now. If we're talking 2045 and you have a Pope Leo that goes that long, what happens to Pope Francis's legacy?
Yeah. And I guess I should clarify. I do think that, carrying on a lot of what Pope Francis did is going to be genuinely a major factor with Pope Leo, but I don't think that's going to be the only thing he's going to be getting up to. For one thing, I think Pope Leo will be building on Pope Leo, right, on the Leo XIII. I think he's already signaled, rerum novarum, right, that kind of a workers' rights, social justice sort of aspect, right? Pope Leo XIII had condemned, communism and capitalism, kind of in different ways in sort of the foundations of Catholic social teaching, about 130 years ago. And I think the new Pope Leo, right, Leo XIV, is going to build on that as well. And I think in the end, it's going to be Pope Francis will always have Pope Francis's legacy. I think he is going to be one that's going to be talked about, right? I don't think he's going to be one of the overlooked popes that you sometimes get to in papal history. I think Pope Leo's mark will stay. Pope Francis's mark will stay. But I think Pope Leo will end up with his own mark, especially if he gets a long pontificate, right? Which is fully expected, right? Just with modern life expectancies and the fact that, he's just 69. So I think, if we see another 20 years of Pope Leo, which I hope for him, I think after year 5, we'll start to see more of what Pope Leo is doing. That's not just kind of, stabilizing and, more deeply rooting some of the things that Pope Francis's priority. I think we'll see more of Pope Leo as we go deeper into his papacy. And partially just that's kind of how people work, right? Usually, one of the things that struck me was that if you look back, Pope Francis at this point in his papacy was emphasizing continuity with Pope Benedict. Honestly, to a fairly similar extent to what we're seeing now with Pope Leo and Pope Francis. So it's fairly normal to have that kind of uniting message right after a conclave, in part because that's what, will get you elected Pope in a conclave, because cardinals don't want the church to be split. That's not in anybody's interest. And so figuring out ways to bring people together, like you said, that's been surprisingly effective. I honestly thought that there would be more controversy and pushback, right? That's why I did, an episode on my show, talking about some of the things that could be used to question the legitimacy of the conclave. Not that I was, looking forward to that, but I was just here are things that need to be flagged and discussed, right? So that, if they want to have an election without any controversy, without any question marks, these are the things that they will be talking about. And ultimately they did discuss all of those things, right? They figured out, how to get together as a body and waive the formal cap of 120 cardinal electors, right? They ended up having 133 actually participating in the conclave. And, there were some age questions that got figured out with some of the African cardinals where the, birth records are not good, which is an interesting thing to still be dealing with, sort of that colonial legacy. But yeah, all sorts of little issues, and it'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out in the long run.
What would you like to see come out of this papacy? Maybe 1 year from now and 5 years from now.
Yeah. So I do still think it'll be, one of my favorite pet topics, the cardinals topic, just because I don't think we're going to see, women's ordination. You might see unordained women deacons, but I don't think you're going to see ordination like people keep talking about, right? That's one of the favorite talking points, but I think that door is closed. And I know people are going to keep knocking, but I think in the end, the idea of having women actually choosing who the bishops are, and all the bishops, not just, a certain portion, right? But I think having that ability to help figure out and select future bishops is something that is a realistic kind of compromise as far as that goes, right? Without a need to change theology. Because, back in the day, it was, not just the clergy, but also the people of Rome that were the ones electing popes before the, became restricted to the College of Cardinals. So I do have hope for that. But at the end of the day, I'm not here to give the church, marching orders, right? It's going to be something I'll keep talking about until, Pope Francis, or, well, I guess not Pope Francis anymore, but Pope Leo, asked me to stop talking about that. I'll probably keep bringing it up. The other thing that I have a lot of hope for is something that I neglected to mention earlier, as something that I do think is a real possibility of, what to look forward to. Ecumenical relations, in particular with Orthodoxy. Patriarch Bartholomew went to Pope Francis's funeral, and then he was present at Pope Leo's inauguration, and then he came like a third time, like another week later, for, I forget what feast it was, but basically, he's been really putting in some mileage between Constantinople and Rome, Istanbul and Rome, right? So there's very much an eagerness there to make a good connection. And before Pope Francis's death, both Pope Francis and Patriarch Bartholomew were talking publicly and openly about their desire to have a unified calendar as far as Easter goes, which is as you know, one of the most long-running questions in the church. And so I think there's a real chance of that getting some sort of resolution. In particular, there's this 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea, right? Which is basically, that anniversary is happening now because the council was going on around now. But with Pope Francis's death, they had an event planned for last month. Obviously, that did not pan out. But that has been pushed back, I believe, to like the Feast of St. Andrew, which I think is late October, I want to say, or early November. So they're planning on, so Patriarch Bartholomew and Pope Leo actually have confirmed that looks like Pope Leo is going to be going to Turkey, as what is probably going to be his first international trip, for, I believe, the Feast of St. Andrew, which is November 30th, if I'm thinking correctly. It might be different because Eastern versus Western, again, that calendar division. But that, it looks like that's going to be sort of the rain date for that, connecting for that Nicaea anniversary. And part of Nicaea was that dating of Easter controversy, right? The first time they really hammered that out. So I think that's in the works, and I do fully expect that. And that makes me wonder, like, if there's more reuniting to be done, right? And what would be exciting, in particular about, an East-West détente, is this would be the first time it's been done without some sort of like existential threat. Because 1452, they had, proclamations of unity, East and West reunited because, it was basically the end of the world as far as the Orthodox were concerned with, Constantinople under its final siege, right? And fell in 1453. And then all that kind of got undone just because of, well, honestly, the public pushback among the Orthodox and just, well, we tried that, see how that worked out. Let's go back to our traditions, right? So just, they've had a few different periods of healing this schism, and it's never stuck. And I think if it happened, and I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility, like they've already removed their mutual excommunications. So I think if they do fully heal that schism, whatever that the compromise is made look like, I do think it would stick more effectively. Although it would not, I don't think, be a full healing, because ultimately Orthodoxy itself is not united currently, right? I mean, part of what makes it easier for Patriarch Bartholomew to talk to Rome and to, come over there, apparently every weekend, nearly, is that currently Moscow and Constantinople are not united themselves, right? They've split, they've gone into schism internally within Orthodoxy over the Ukraine and Russia situation, which I think, kind of, it frees up Patriarch Bartholomew to talk to Pope Leo. So we'll see what all comes out of that.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. I think there's going to be it's going to be a step-by-step, like they're going to make something big, like trying to align the dates of Easter, do something like that. But I think that the big problem is that there's only so much that the Patriarch Bartholomew can do, because his actual physical church is only the area around Istanbul or Constantinople.
Right.
And even Greece is separate from him, and they'll basically fall in line. But there's a lot of issues. If he pushes it too far, then it really does. It could blow up the whole situation. I think that there is a lot of push inside of that church within the Greeks and Constantinople for a lot more, if not communion, something pretty darn close to it. And then you think about that, like, okay, yeah, communion, that sounds great. Then that opens up a whole nother can of worms after that. Like, what does that really mean?
Yeah. And I think like the monks of Mount Athos, for example,
they're never going
they're
for
really not keen on, reuniting with the West, no matter how much Patriarch Bartholomew seems to be willing to, play with the idea. Right. So yeah, I mean, that'd be interesting to see, what actually happens, at the end. Like, history has all sorts of surprises, has all sorts of back and forth. And I think I have a pretty strong record of not being good at predicting things anyways. So don't go too much into my predictions. But in terms of things that I'm hoping for, I think, East-West reunification would be awesome. I think unification, at least in terms of the dating of Easter, right, is I think that's the most likely.
Yeah, I find too that with Bartholomew, it's a lot. To me, it feels kind of like a political play against Moscow at this point, that he's trying to build up his bulwark against Moscow. And that's having Rome on your side is having a big, kind of like pulling in the tough guy in the schoolyard. It's the big guy, the big kid. If he has Rome on his side, it gives him a lot of weight.
Yeah. It's that, push versus pull factors. Like I said, historically, there is usually pretty large factors, externally, playing into influencing these things that actually get it to come together, at least on paper. Right. But those are usually more temporary. So yes, there is certainly, I think that's a fair observation in terms of, some of what's driving things. But, like I said, I'm more positive about, whatever comes about, especially if it's on the, lighter end. If it's like, full, like, no compromise, absolute reunion, whatever. Hard to tell where the lines are at this point, right? Because you don't know where the lines are until they're drawn. But, if it's, I do think it still has that better chance of sticking, just because like that, the external factors are not as dire as they were, like I said, with the final siege of Constantinople, right? Or like, with the I think the Council of Leon one was like, just like the West just kind of dominating the East, which obviously was not good long term, in terms of those relations. So yeah, just, that's fascinating. Like history, I do think there will be more history being made in the next few years on that front.
And then as a wrap up, where do you think synodality goes from here?
That is hard to predict. I think that's my biggest question mark, because that's the one where I think you're always going to have at least lip service, within the conclave situation, because again, that's, kind of how you get elected Pope. But then like, once you're elected Pope, how does synodality sound to you? Well, I'll put it to you this way. It was weird under Pope Francis because you had this situation where it wasn't the Pope insisting, usually the Pope, the one like, saying, nope, I'm in charge. Right. But with Pope Francis, you had the Pope basically being the one pushing synodality, which was almost a role reversal from like historical cases of, the cardinals wanting to have more influence. So it was like over the objections of the more conservative cardinals that really kind of wanted that more monarchical papacy. So we'll see if Pope Francis, walks that back a bit, or if he does go full in. I think indications are that he's at least going to be as engaged with it as Pope Francis was, which I think there was some nuance with the kind of rubber meets the road. How much synodality did Pope Francis actually do? Because like there were times where he would sort of undercut that push for like that, more, and I guess we should probably clarify, although we're like an hour into this, so it is what it is at this point. But like, that more collaborative model of governing the church, right? That's what we mean by synodality, right? Because a synod is a gathering of bishops, right? So just kind of letting it be done more at that level of the bishops as a whole, instead of the Pope just kind of deciding top down. But Pope Francis's definition of synodality would even include the laity. And that's how you'd see more women getting involved in like the synod on synodality. I saw a lot of, criticism like, oh, this isn't really a synod because, it's not just bishops, right? You've got laity in there. You've got women in there, as voting, full participating members, right? Sitting at these, tables in the Paul VI audience hall, just chatting and voting along with the bishops. And I think to an extent that's here to stay, but it'll be interesting to see what actual form that takes and what kind of interventions Pope Leo does on like a doctrinal level, because like, the situation in Germany, right, with the synodal way, that, Pope Francis was like, look, synodality is good, but this is getting a little bit out of hand, right? That'll be an interesting one to see how that plays out with Pope Leo in place. So I don't know. What do you think?
I think a lot of synodality is the tempering of papal infallibility. Yeah, papal, something is only infallible if it's ex cathedra. But I was talking to a scholar named Sean Blanchard, but he was saying there's always this idea that even though the Pope isn't speaking ex cathedra on something, if the Pope says tomorrow that ice cream isn't a perfectly acceptable breakfast food, that carries a lot of weight.
I mean, it'll get me to sign up automatically. I won't question that.
Anything that the Pope says is in some people's eyes is approaching infallibility just because he said it. And I think that that's that real Vatican I idea. And there's been a tempering of that. And maybe we need 20 or 40 or 60 more years of tempering to say that, you know what, everything doesn't have to be directed through the Pope, and these synods can come up with their own ideas, I think. But like you were saying with the German synods, is that how are they going to play inside of the bigger rules, and how do you establish bigger rules without it, again, going back to being monarchical?
Right. I mean, like, you know, the question of like women's ordination again, right? I think that's one of the more, you know, hot topic questions with the Synodal way in Germany. I believe that, you know, some of the discussion there is like, okay, well, you know, if they decide to have women deacons there, like, if the church says yes to that there, then that kind of removes, you know, the objections for the rest of the world, right? Even if it's one of those things so they get like a line item exemption, like Africa did for enforcing the informal blessings for gay folks, fiducia supplicans. Like, is this going to be like a local exemption sort of thing? Like, I don't think that would be something that would be granted, right? Just because of the implications. But I mean, for example, you know, going back to Orthodoxy, there's in one of the Alexandrian churches, I forget which one, but it's one of the Alexandrian churches somewhere in Africa. They actually have, and from what I can tell, it's, you know, full on women's ordination and not an unordained female deacon role, right? But actually like an ordained woman deacon or several in one of these Alexandrian Orthodox churches in Africa. That's, you know, it's not like super fringe. From what I could tell, it's in communion, right, with I believe Constantinople, at least. So like, you know, if you get things, you know, just making decisions at the local level, then, you know, it doesn't start to look more like Anglicanism, right, where these big theological questions are, you know, just kind of punted just for the sake of having this formal unity over all the church. Or do we get, again, like you said, that more monarchical? Like, I think probably it will end up more on the monarchical side, but not like as hardcore as, you know, Pio Nono and Vatican I.
Yeah. Yeah. Like in that situation, it was the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Alexandria, which is different than the Oriental Orthodox Patriarch of Alexandria. It's a pretty small church, but it was a full-blown ordained deaconess. And, you know, that's one of those things. So in a communion like Orthodoxy, where there isn't a central monarchical situation, maybe the other churches don't accept her ordination, and maybe Alexandria keeps ordaining them, or maybe they stop, where they're in that mechanism in the Catholic Church where the Pope can put a stop to something, or on the other hand, say that, yeah, that's good to go. Like you said, would a Pope necessarily give up that authority, or would people accept them abrogating that authority?
Yeah. I mean, there's also always going to be that question of, you know, what to the relevant, you know, laity, right? And just the faithful as a whole, like, you know, what are they going to accept regardless of, you know, what the individual church leaders want to do or don't want to do.
Or I wonder if the church has to, or if the Pope has to set up like a layer of synods, and synodality becomes much more solidified and more rigid in a way where, okay, Germany, you say you're going to do this, that has to get kicked up to a higher level synod. And then the Pope is the ultimate, the buck stops at his desk. That's, I think, the things that are going to really have to play out in the next 15, 20 years, and probably the Pope after Leo the 14th.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. Like, picture something like super bishop conferences, like be almost like, Orthodoxy has a rolling synod structure, right? Like, it's kind of generally ongoing, right? Because that's sort of their official way of governing. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how all that plays out. And speaking of the future, I don't know if you saw, but just yesterday, speaking of international visits for Pope Leo, apparently he has confirmed that he will be going to Argentina. There's not a date set, but apparently, Argentina's president met with him yesterday, and that was one of the things that came out of it. Pope Francis never went there because I think he was just worried about, showing favoritism. I think he would have liked to have gone back eventually, but then, it just never happened.
Time goes by.
Yeah. Look at your watch. It's like, oh, look at the time. But I mean, he did have that 14-day run around through all of Oceania, in the last, year of his life and papacy. So, it still surprises me a bit that he didn't go, but he didn't go. And it looks like Pope Leo is going to go ahead and go there. So we'll see what that looks like. And we'll see if and when, probably he will at some point, because if you got a long papacy, you're going to end up in the U.S. at some point. But we'll see what that looks like when that actually happens. I know I'll be there in some fashion.
Yeah, that'll be a blowout for sure.
Oh, yeah. They've got tickets sold out just for the mass that he's just, videoing in for, I think it'd probably be 5-10 minutes.
All right. Well, Greg, why don't you tell us where we can find your podcast just to remind everyone?
Yeah. So Popular History is the name of the podcast. That's popular, but with an E for the Pope pun. And theoretically, I've got a website, popularhistory.com, but it does not update apart from the RSS feeds. There's an issue. I need to figure that out eventually. But for right now, my main focus at the moment is family. I'm going back into my hiatus, but I'll have some content coming out, kind of conclave leftovers, which is not to sell it short. But popularhistory.com or the Popular History podcast on any good podcatchers. Steve, thank you very much. And where can we find you?
You can find the history of the papacy on a2zhistorypage.com or by just searching in your podcatcher of choice, or at YouTube at youtube.com at A2Z History Page. Really, the big things that are coming up, I'm going to do a short series on the history of the Catholic Church in the United States from 1776 to the Civil War. So I'm going to really try and narrow it in and see if I can stick to that limiting factor. And then after that, this is very tentative, and I haven't really said this yet, but I'm looking to launch a new podcast with a friend of mine, James Early, on key battles of the Middle Ages. So using his format of key battles of American history, we're going to focus in on medieval battles, but then the history of the papacy. What I would like to really do is mirror those episodes with deep dives into church history, cultural history, because I've been dying to get back into Middle Ages history, and that's my favorite part. And I could never limit myself to just the battles as much as I do enjoy the battles. I want to dig into a lot of the church history and the popes of that and time and bishops, cultural history.
That'll be some good tie-in framework.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think there's so much. I'll probably wind up going well beyond what we do in the as far as episode numbers once I get going on church history.
Don't we all, though? That's history podcasting in a nutshell.
Yeah, you can't help yourself. My one episode on the first temple of Jerusalem turned into an 8-part series. That's just, that's how it goes.
I'm 5 years into my 2-part, introduction. So,
and there's plenty of content for everyone to enjoy.
Well, awesome. Thank you for breaking news. All right.
All right. Yeah, and if anybody has comments on this, we'd love to hear what you have to say about the Pope and this new Pope and what you think is coming up. And yeah, we'll talk to you guys next time.
Thank you.
The Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.